Everybody, and thank you so much for coming to our event. We're so very proud to be publishing James Mayhew's extraordinary, beautiful Once Upon a Tune. I don't know when James first had the idea for the book, but it took root for me after going to an amazing concert with James, where he did his storytelling and his artwork alongside a live orchestra. After the event, there were book sales, but there was nothing that really reflected our musical experience. And I felt there ought to be that book. And so now there is. James has brought all his passion for inspiring young people to engage with classical music. And he tells the stories of 6 fabulous, famous pieces of orchestral music that are really suitable for children and families, together with this most stunning, gorgeous, jewel-like artwork. Really wonderful, and information at the back about the composers and James's favorite recordings. It's a beautiful gift, and also should be in every primary school in the country, we think. Thank you, James. I would also like to thank the team at Otterbury Books, Gail, Katerina, Nikki, Jill, Laura and David and Joe, but especially Judith Escreet, who designed the book with James and worked so very hard on it. And the result is just amazing. And last but not least, we're so grateful to you, Nikki, for hosting the event. And I just can't wait to hear the conversation that you're going to have with James. So over to you, Nikki.
Thanks, Janetta. Well, I'm honoured to be asked to host this event. It's like, I don't know, it's like Christmas has come. So a little introduction to James, and then the bit that you all would like to hear is from James himself, but he does need an introduction. He deserves an introduction. You already know that he's an illustrator, storyteller and performer with a long-held passion for both art and music education. His earlier books, both in the Katie and the Ella Bella series, have sought to open up the worlds of art and music from the ballet for young readers. His association with various orchestras has been hugely successful in engaging family audiences with classical music. I have, for a long time, been an admirer of James's art and his achievements, but the publication of Mrs. Noah's Pockets, in collaboration with Jackie Morris, marked for me an exciting new period of creativity and experimentation. And this new book, Once Upon a Time, Stories from the Orchestra, I think shows that James has continued experimenting and producing a book which is even more exciting in its interplay of word and image, with music playing in the background, of course. There's great depth, by which I mean not only the depth that we recognise in these classic stories, but in the artwork too. I kid you not, when I first saw the full page spread of The Sorcerer's Castle, I thought the pages were die cut. So clever was the illusion that you could step through the door or climb through the windows. I'm sure James will tell us more about how he achieved that effect and managed to overcome the problem of flattening out, which can happen in the printing process. I do not think it's overstating it to say that I think this book deserves to become a classic, just as the stories it tells are classics. It deserves to have the longevity of a book like Brian Wildsmith's Nursery Rhymes. I strongly expect it to be a contender for the Greenaway Medal, and I would dearly love to see it nominated for the Bologna Ragazzi Prize. I'm all a tremble with anticipation, as you can probably tell, as I welcome James Mayhew to begin our celebration of Once Upon a Tune. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Nikki, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm so excited to be here on what's a day I've waited for so long for. And I have to say a quick thank you to Janetta at Otterbury Books and Jude and the whole team there for believing in the book, because it took me a long time to find a home for it, a long time to find a publisher who really understood and believed in it. So here it finally is, publication day.
Exciting. Now, We've got so much to get through this evening. It's going to be a very rich exploration. And we're going to start as where all good places start, which is at the beginning. And I'd love to know where this passion for music, storytelling, and art came from. Where did it originate?
Well, I think we have to go back to when I was very young. I remember going to the cinema and seeing Fantasia, the Disney film, which uses classical music, and I was terrified by it, especially the Night on the Bare Mountain scene with a big demon rising off a mountain. But I loved the music and I wanted to hear it again. And my parents, I mean, I lived in a very ordinary home. I went to ordinary comprehensive schools. There were no concert halls where I grew up, in a tiny village in Suffolk. It was a very sort of narrow childhood in that respect. But they did have a few LPs. They had a few classical LPs hiding amongst the Beatles and the Seekers and that sort of stuff. And it was the usual sort of culprits. They had an LP of Peer Gynt. They had an LP of some Russian music, including Flight of the Bumblebee. But the one that really captured my imagination was Scheherazade. And it was only because of the cover that I wanted to play the record. It had an illustration by Edmund Dulac on the cover. You should be able to see that now. And it just opened a door on all sorts of interests, on the Arabian Nights, on Edmund Dulac as an illustrator. He became a real hero of mine, huge inspiration. I became fascinated with Islamic art and design. I did a project, in fact, at art school on Islamic art and design. But crucially, it also opened up the door to the music by Rimsky-Korsakov, which it's not too much of a cliche to say it carried me away on a flying carpet of sound. I just thought it was the most magical and marvelous music. And I started drawing to it. I started drawing and doodling, learning about what stories were mentioned in the titles of the various sections, and just falling in love with the whole thing.
Can I just ask, that drawing to music, that seems like a really great idea that children can do. Were you trying to draw the story, or were you just responding to the feeling that you had from listening to the music?
I was drawing the story. I was drawing characters from the story. I was drawing Arabian Nights palaces and that sort of thing. But I have used the idea of music workshops in schools. I visited many, many schools where I do painting to music workshops, and we play the music once and I demonstrate how I paint the music, and then the children have a go and the music is played a second time, sometimes even a third time if they need extra time to finish their art. And it's really interesting to see how children approach this, because a lot of children will try to do something similar to what I did. Others will be still illustrative in terms of following the narrative of the story, but something independent. And then you'll always get a handful of children, a few children, who will do something completely abstract and will be just a completely emotional reaction to the sound of the music. And it's fabulous. And all of those approaches are valid. It's just wonderful to see the breadth and diversity that you get in a project like that in the classroom.
Brilliant. Well, I think we're going to go on to see some slides which show your process of working with orchestras. I'm going to take my cue from you when you want me to move on to the next slide. So do say next slide. I'll be
okay. Well, next slide. So fast forward many, many years later, I'd been a book illustrator and a writer for some time. And amongst my books was a volume called Koshka's Tales, which included The Firebird. And I was at a book festival telling the story. And when I tell stories, I always draw pictures. And the organizer said, how about doing this with an orchestra? Then you'd have the music as well. So they introduced me to a local orchestra in Hatfield called the de Havilland Philharmonic. And I couldn't see how it was going to work, because my usual approach to illustration was very fine, delicate pen and ink work. And it just didn't look any good on the screen at all. It looked awful. So I realized I was going to have to find a new way of painting. And as you can see in this slide, I'm working on a black canvas and painting very rich, bright colors. So if you imagine a theater, a theatrical setting, the lights are down, it's very dark, and then you have a black canvas, and suddenly all these pops of color appear in time to the music. It makes it much more exciting to do it that way. So I'm painting completely differently to how I illustrate the books, and also very, very quickly, because a lot of these pieces of music are extremely short. So that's how it began. The very first concert was The Firebird and Peter and the Wolf, and it worked. Everybody loved it. And since then, I've been doing concerts every year with that orchestra, but it's expanded to cover many, many, many more orchestras, and even ended up during the pandemic, I did some presenting for an online channel for BBC National Orchestra of Wales. So it's been a wonderful project for me to explore all this music. And we have some more slides. So if you'd like to click.
Mm. It
one
looks
of-
like it looks like you enjoy dressing up, James.
This was one of my favorite occasions. This was in Cheltenham at the music festival, and they had an orchestra over from Singapore, and called the Orchestra of the Music Makers. And they were huge. There were 110 people of them. There was barely room for me on the stage. And they played Scheherazade. They were rather apologetic. They said, we'd love to do a concert with James, but the only piece we've got on our repertoire that's spare is Scheherazade. Would that do? I said, yes, yes. So well, it was a lucky break. And so, yes, I thought I can't just wear black concert dress for Scheherazade. I need a costume. So there we are. And you can see me working at the easel here. What you can't see is how it's projected onto a screen, but you'll see that in perhaps one of the other slides if we click.
There we are.
There we are. So this was in Manchester with the Piccadilly Symphony Orchestra, great band. And you can probably see that there's some other paintings on the floor. So I do many, many paintings during a concert usually, and then pop them off the easel and begin the next one straight away. This is a particular scene from Scheherazade. So yes, it's expanded. I work with many, many different ensembles and musicians. And through doing this, I've discovered all sorts of fascinating stories. Some of them I already knew, but a lot of them I didn't know. I don't always choose the repertoire. Sometimes orchestras come to me and say, oh, we're going to be performing this with the orchestra. Could you have a go with it? So then begins a period of research where I try to find out what subject attracted the composer. So almost all the music that they perform is what we call program music, or music that has a story or narrative. In other words, music that has been based on a particular myth or legend. Most of this music is really famous, really well known, sort of stuff you'd hear on classic FM. Most of the music is tunes you could whistle, but most of the music is stories that you won't necessarily know about. So the mission with these concerts, and now with this book, has been to restore the correct story to the right piece of music. So instead of hearing all these tunes in movies, which we do, or even in adverts, I mean, some of the music which is featured in the book I've heard in pizza ads, for heaven's sake. People know the music, but they don't know what it's supposed to represent. They might think, oh, that's a nice tune, but they don't know what it's really about. They don't know the story it's telling. And music is a really great way of telling a story, because it's always moving forward in the same way that a storytelling does.
Can I ask you, James, how spontaneous are the pictures, or how many times do you have to work them out and practice them before you paint on the night?
I do practice a lot, obviously at home with a CD to begin with. Sometimes I have the luxury of working with the orchestra for a couple of days before the performance to rehearse, but not always. So I have to be very well prepared at home. I like to leave a bit of flexibility for improvisation, but I need to be very well prepared, because there's no good turning up on the day and then thinking, oh, I wish I brought my yellow paint now. It's too late. You know, I need to have everything with me that I want to use on the day. So there's a blueprint in place, but it's always different. You know, you can practice as many times as you like at home, but when you walk on stage with this huge orchestra around you and there's an audience waiting in a concert hall, and your nerves play a part of it, it's a completely different experience. And actually the sounds that you hear in the orchestra are different too. So suddenly you think, do you know what? That doesn't sound like it needs blue. It sounds like it needs red. It's more dramatic than I realized. And you grab the red paint and you go for it. So there is a lot of spontaneity.
I love that. Shall we move on to the next slide? I don't know if you want to move through them more quickly, that's fine. Just tell me.
Okay, no, I mean, we can move fairly quickly now because I've explained most of the process. So this is the BBC National Orchestra of Wales. This is the Swan of Tuonela, which is one of the stories in the book, which is why I wanted to include it. So we can move on now. This is me about to shoot an apple off the conductor's head with my crossbow. And a painting for William Tell, also included in the book. So most of the stories that I wanted to include managed to get into the book. It's very hard to squeeze them all in. There are a few stories, you know, I've got some spares. There was a very big long list at one point, but these are my favorites. The 6 stories in the book are my absolute favorites that I felt they just have to go in. And this is not one of the stories in the book. This was a new commission. This was by a modern living composer, and he wrote a piece called If I Had Wings. And I don't know if you can see that, you probably can't, but on the right, at a lectern is Michael Rosen, who wrote the script. And on the left at an easel is me frantically painting. It's based on the legend of Icarus. So that was at the Albert Hall. That was pretty exciting to stand on the stage at the Albert Hall and paint with not just an orchestra, but a chorus in this instance. So out of all my work with orchestras, I ended up being commissioned to design sets and costumes for a production of Noah's Flood, the children's opera by Benjamin Britten. And it was written specifically to be performed in churches or abbeys. This is Tewkesbury Abbey near Cheltenham. And because of the difficulty in seeing the children, I came up with the idea of making shapes of animals, putting some on banners and some are cutouts. If we move forward the slide, I think we can see some cutouts. There they are. And again, a very different way of working, thinking much more about shape than line. And Jackie Morris was very inspired by the story of Noah's Flood, because Mrs. Noah is a real character in it. At one point, she actually slaps Mr. Noah, and she refuses to get on the ark when the flood comes and wants to stay with the gossips, who are also characters in the story. It's based on a Chester miracle play. It's a very ancient text. And so out of this project came Mrs. Noah's Pockets, which she wrote specially for me. And when I first started illustrating it, I thought, I don't know how I'm going to illustrate this. My usual way of illustrating just doesn't suit it. And it was actually quite a difficult time. I was quite worried for a period because I thought, I don't know what I'm going to do. She's written this story for me and it's Jackie. How can you say no to Jackie? So I had to come up with a solution, and it took a long time. And there was a day when I had got very frustrated and I ripped some papers up, and suddenly out of these bits of paper, I saw a landscape. I saw a sky, and I saw trees. And my husband came home from work and said, that's it, that's the answer, that's what you need to do, that's the technique to use. So I started using collage. I introduced a lot of printmaking. You might be able to see in these textures here, and I'll talk you through the process if we move forward in the slides.
Should we talk about the selection of the stories and then come back to the process?
Yeah, we can do that. So
and that is Mrs. No, that's back. Now we're on stories from the orchestra, aren't we? So
yes,
let me just stop the share for a minute, because we're going to talk a little bit about the selection of the stories, and then we're going to go in and look in more depth at the process.
Perfect.
And what you've said is, when we think about classical music and story, there are some pieces that come very quickly to mind, like Peter and the Wolf and Carnival of the Animals. And probably for very good reason, you've chosen not to include those. But you've chosen these 6 stories, which you say are your favourites. But I wonder what the process was. Were you focusing principally on the music or on the story? What did it mean to choose the 6 best stories?
Well, it was a balance of several things, Nikki. I mean, you're right, we rejected Peter and the Wolf. That's slightly complicated with copyright, for starters. Carnival of the Animals doesn't actually have any story narrative attached to it, although I think Ogden Nash wrote some verse, but I wanted to write my own texts for this book. So that ruled those 2 out. So we were looking at other things, and we wanted a range of stories from different cultures and different composers. We wanted different kinds of stories. We wanted stories that were suitable for younger children, maybe Key Stage 1, and stories that are more suitable for older children, more in the sort of mythological realm rather than the fairy tale realm. So we wanted that breadth in the book. So The Sorcerer's Apprentice seemed like a really obvious one to include. Everybody's familiar with that, thanks to Fantasia again. But beyond that, it was quite a personal choice. I mean, I remember my father playing William Tell. He loved Rossini, so that was one I was very fond of and wanted to include. And it's great in concert. It's a great one to end a concert with. Obviously, I had to include Scheherazade. And I think that was a particularly important choice for me, because most of the pieces in this book are short, single pieces, whereas Scheherazade is a large work with 4 big movements. And some of the stories I've included the title of just extracts. For example, The Flight of the Bumblebee is just an extract from a bigger work, an opera, The Tale of Tsar Sultan. But I didn't want to call the story The Tale of Tsar Sultan. That creates a barrier. I wanted to call the story The Flight of the Bumblebee and focus on that. But for Scheherazade, I wanted to include the whole work. I didn't want to just use one of the little stories that he references, Rimsky-Korsakov references in the music. For example, Sinbad, the sailor, one of the movements is called the Sea and Sinbad Ship. So I could have just focused on that, but I didn't want to. I wanted to focus on Scheherazade. The reason being is because the world of classical music is dominated by men, unfortunately. That's beginning to change now in our time, but historically it's a very male dominated area of art, I suppose you could call it. And even the stories seem to end up with mostly boys and men. So I felt it was really important for the biggest piece, the biggest story, the biggest work of music to be this magnificent, incredible, brave, powerful queen, Scheherazade, who saves her life by telling stories. What an awesome thing to do. So she's, for me, really kind of the star of the book in a way. Also, I wanted to include it because, of course, the stories are all from Asia. They're from Persia through India all the way to China. It's a very rich canon of folklore from the Middle East right across to China. So I felt it was important not just to have European stories, but to try to cover Asia as well. So Scheherazade was the ideal vehicle for that. The wild card is the Swan of Tuonela, and I included that because I love the Kalevala. It's from this collection of Finnish mythology, the Kalevala. It isn't very well known, and most people remember it mainly because of the music by Sibelius. It's quite different music. It's quite haunting and melancholy music. When I've used it in the classroom, it goes down a storm. They love the story, which is quite dark, but they love the sound of the music as well. They find it quite hypnotic, I think. So that was the wild card. That was the one I was worried wouldn't get in the book, and I'm really glad it did, because I think it's such a powerful story of a mother's love, a mother's devotion to her boy. She'll do anything to bring him back to life. It's actually quite poignant.
Is that a cor anglais in that? Is it a cor anglais in that piece?
Yes, and it's such a plaintive sound that it makes. It's just such a beautiful piece of music, but also such a really deeply moving story for me. I just think it's an incredibly powerful story, and hopefully it will open doors again and encourage people to go on and look at the Kalevala and find out more about that, because it's an extraordinary collection of mythology, specifically from Finland, very ancient, which many people don't know about or haven't heard of. And the last story, which I haven't mentioned yet, was In the Hall of the Mountain King. And again, I didn't want to call the story Peer Gynt, because many people nowadays, modern kids, they might think, well, what does that mean? Whereas In the Hall of the Mountain King, it's much more descriptive as a title. And also in this instance, I only focus on the early part of Ibsen's play that Grieg set to music. I don't attempt to tell the whole play, because that would have used up all my 96 pages trying to tell that extraordinary
Very, very wise. And I have to say, I like the way that you dealt with the ending in that story, because, you know, Peer Gynt, he's not a very nice guy, really. And you kind of leave it a little bit open by placing this distance between your two characters at that point. And yet it is still a reasonably rounded off ending for children to read.
That was the one I found hardest. I rewrote that ending many, many, many times, Nikki, because it is a difficult story to tell. It's because it's only a piece of a story, and it's not a typical sort of happy ever after ending. And actually the whole play isn't really. He's a very troubled, strange character, and the play is full of bizarre symbols. But that section, the encounter with the trolls, is such a fantastic story as well. I really, really wanted to include it. Such a well-known piece of music. And I think you might have a surprise up your sleeve, in fact.
I've always got a surprise up my sleeve, you know that. So here we go.
So with a click of a few buttons, we'll have a bit of magic.
Skill learnt today.
So while the music's playing, I'm just going to hold up to the screen the sketchbook. So this is how it began. And I don't think Janetta will mind me saying that originally the book was supposed to be 46 pages, and I just couldn't fit in all the pictures and all the stories I wanted. So she did her sums very carefully and said I could have 96 pages. And I'm very glad she did.
Absolutely stunning. And that image of the Troll King is one of my favourites in the book.
Oh, I had such fun doing that.
Well, there's a lot more that I could ask you about the selection, but I think if we do that, we'll miss out on, looking at the process. So perhaps we can leave some more questions to the end and get on to looking at the your artistic process, which I'm sure everybody would like to have a look at. So this is where we left off with Mrs. Noah.
So this is my studio. This is where I'm sitting right now. And if I were to turn my camera, it's in a similar state to in this photograph, because I'm in the middle of the next Mrs. Noah book, Mrs. Noah's Song. And collage makes a mess, but a terrible mess. And you can see some of it here, but it's the only way I can do it. So there are bits and bits of paper all over the place. And I make my own papers. Very rarely, very occasionally, I'll buy a specific paper. For some of the backgrounds in Scheherazade, I had these beautiful papers I bought in Spain, which had these lovely Moorish sort of patterns on them based on Islamic designs. So they were ideal for the backgrounds in Scheherazade. So on the desk there, you can see I'm working on an illustration. This is one of the pieces from Scheherazade, from Sinbad, the sailor in particular. So, so yeah, I just make my papers and cut them up and stick them down. One of the ways I make my paper is with lino cuts, and I love lino, and most of the lino cuts that I make are quite abstract. So these are just sort of swirly shapes that will be useful for lots of different things. And then obviously I roll the ink and I print them, but I print them in many colors. Sometimes I print them 2 or 3 times on the same piece of paper to get a really rich effect on the paper.
Mm-hmm. It makes it very textured. Can I just briefly ask you why you prefer lino to, say, vinyl, which is a lot softer, isn't it, to cut into?
Well, actually, some of this probably is vinyl. So I've got both things. I think the one on top is vinyl. The one underneath is the old-fashioned lino, the harder stuff. You get a different effect. So if you want something broader and coarser, then the hard lino is great. But if you want something really delicate and filigree, then the vinyl is because it's softer, is easy to control. So it has its uses.
And all of the colouring is done with the printing. It's not coloured. There's no colouring afterwards. Occasionally,
there might be a bit of additional drawing or scribbling on top, as with Mrs. Noah. So yes, there are some bits, some details that you just can't create in collage, figures in the distance, that sort of thing. So certain bits and pieces, certain small details will be painted on top. So you can see on that piece of paper there, I've printed 2 or 3 times in slightly different shades of blues and purples to get a really strange effect, which it could be the walls of a cave, it could be the capes of the king of the trolls, it could be the sea for Sinbad to sail on. It could be useful for many different things.
Seems very playful, this stage.
It's wonderfully playful, and I think for me, one of the joys of doing this is that it has brought the play back into my work. After many, many years of working on books like the Katie series and Ella Bella, because they are long-running series of many, many books, you end up feeling quite restricted. You learn new skills, you develop as an artist, but you can't use that knowledge because you always have to be looking backwards and trying to keep the next book consistent with the one before, or the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 before. So being able to do this and being able to play and experiment has been really liberating and has really given me back that sense of thrill. I remember with Mrs. Noah, I remember laying some pieces of paper out on the very first illustration and just stopping and thinking, ooh, I like that. And I hadn't felt that for a long time. And now I do. Now I'm working on these illustrations and I surprise myself. I think I don't have a preconceived idea in my head of what the illustration is going to look like in the same way that I do when I'm drawing. When you're drawing, you have much more control in a sense, because you're creating the thing in line and then essentially coloring it in. It's more sophisticated than that, but that's the basic nuts and bolts. Whereas with this, you're not drawing in the same way. You're creating images out of shape. You're creating form, shape, sometimes pattern, and you can move things around endlessly until it's glued. Everything is movable, everything can change. So it gives you great freedom, great play, great creativity. It's like being a kid again. You can see the lino here has been used for fire instead of the sea. So it's very versatile. Just one lino cut can lend itself to many different things. Excuse me.
So are there lots and lots of different pieces here? Because one of the things that I felt, I talked about depth earlier, and this book felt very much like theatrical flats, that you could walk through these layers of the picture. And I wondered if that's created by this layering of paper.
I think you do get a sense of that. And because it's not just paper as well, if you look at there's a princess being swallowed up by magic fire on the right, and she's wearing clothes made out of fabric, paisley fabric. I discovered that paisley fabric is actually an ancient Persian design. So that's why I've used that in the Scheherazade story. And of course, there's bits of music paper collaged in there as well. So all these different layers, all these different kinds of printmaking in different colors, they do build up the layers and create wonderful depth. And it surprises me, sometimes I don't realize until after I've sort of put it all together on the piece of paper in front of me, just how exciting and theatrical it can be. I mean, I think I had a sense of wanting it to be theatrical. Obviously, we're inhabiting the world of theatre and concert halls here, and the world of imagination. And I had wanted to study theatre design many years ago as an art student, and I didn't. I chose illustration in the end. So this allows me to kind of satisfy part of that. It allows me to sort of explore that sort of sense of theatre in the art.
Shall I move on?
So this is a very early stage of a piece from William Tell, and I included it because the lighting, I think you can see quite clearly from the shadows how the pieces of paper are being layered and how thick some of the paper is. So the sky isn't printmaking, that's been painted and then drawn on with a white pencil crayon. The flash of lightning has just been cut out of a piece of white paper. The castle is just textured paper with a crayon rubbed on it, and so on and so on. So there are many different kinds of paper here, which I think also gives a huge sense of depth to the whole thing.
You've never used mono printing for your backgrounds?
Yes, I have used mono printing. Often when I've done some lino printing, the waves at the front are lino printed. There'll be some ink left on my tabletop. I've got a glass table, so it's great for rolling out ink on. And rather than just throw away the ink, I just press sheets of paper into it and rub them on top and make mono prints that way. And they can be useful for all sorts of things, usually sort of background things, texture things. This is the illustration in an early stage. So I cut out the words and make sure that there's space for them. It's always really, really important to leave the space for the words. And this again shows how versatile the lino cuts are, because I've used the same one for the mane on a horse, and also for the mane on the elk. So the elk is made of moss. It's a monstrous elk made of moss that's summoned up in the story of the Swan of Tuonela, and has to be captured by this hero Lemminkainen in order to win the hand of a princess, the Maid of the North. He also has to capture this horse, the devil's horse, that appears in the sunrise, made of fire, and he sings a song to the gods of the sky to extinguish the fire so that he can ride it into the palace of the princess's mother. It's the mother who sets him these tasks.
I'm going to move a little, if you don't mind, James, although I could stay for 3 hours listening to you talk about process. Just so that we leave a little bit of time at the end for questions, I'm going to move a bit more quickly through the next slides.
Absolutely, yeah. So as you've probably noticed, there are bits of music throughout. They're all the original scores. I couldn't bring myself to destroy them. I photocopied them all, but they are all the actual music. The right music is in the right illustrations.
It's wonderful. I love that printing on top of the music.
Yeah, so this is another one of the liner cuts I did. This was just a sort of floral design, which was very useful, particularly for Russian costumes in the Flight of the Bumblebee.
Mm.
The one piece of liner that was less abstract and very specific was the Russian city that's again in the Flight of the Bumblebee. So this was just a rubbing of it with a crayon. But if we go to the next slide, you can see that I'm collaging it. I've printed it dozens of times in many, many different colors, cut them all up and then assembled them. It's also like a crazy jigsaw, and you haven't got the lid of the box to work it all out. And it was quite intricate. And what the problem with it is, you have to make a decision at the end of the day. You have to say, okay, that's it. But I'm always coming back to it and thinking, well, I could just move this little tiny tower a millimeter to the right. You can just play endlessly. But I love the sort of dazzling effect of all those different colors.
Oh,
so these are the chapter headings. These are very specific liner cuts. So a motif or a symbol or a design for each of the stories, which appear as chapter headings, and also reduced, very small, for the end papers. And this is the prize tonight.
It is.
You go on to the next slide.
It is. We will just say we've drawn a winner, haven't we? So we hope they're in the room.
Yes, so you'll have to stay till the very end, because we're not going to till the very end.
Yes.
So I have printed all of these off. There's a snap of me printing the chapter heading for Scheherazade. And if you go to the next slide, you can see all of the liner cuts. So they're behind me in a drawer, waiting to be posted to the winner, who we will pick at the end of tonight. Covers are always difficult. So an early cover design had these decorative borders around the name, my name, and I tried different color borders as well. There was something that didn't feel quite right. I just felt it was a bit fussy. So at the last minute, actually, I suddenly thought, no, I'm not doing that. So if you go to the next slide, at the last minute, I just simplified everything and put things together like that, which I think is a much cleaner design. I'm much happier with that. And that's what we ended up with. And even the title, Once Upon a Tune, is cut out.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. So we're going to go on to the stories now and the finished art. So here we have the castle that you mentioned that you felt looked die cut. This is from the Sorcerer's Apprentice. This is the last illustration I did. I'd done a castle previously, and again, right at the last minute, I thought, nope, not good enough. So I did another castle, and much happier this one.
What do you think it is that gives it that, that feeling? Is it the shadow? You put kind of thin strips of shadow around the arches, haven't you?
Yes, I think there's a strong sense of light. Obviously, you've got the sun there and strong light and shade in the image. And also, it's in a sense, it's quite intricate. It's made up of a lot more pieces of paper than you might suppose, and many, many different textures. So I think all of those things help give it a real sense of depth. And I think drama as well. I wanted to make it look quite Gothic and Germanic to go with the setting of the story.
I hope there are going to be some posters. I want this on my wall.
So here we have the Sorcerer's Apprentice himself. And if you were interested and nerdy, you might like to know that the text he's holding in the story, it says he's holding a list that of tasks he's been given by the sorcerer. It's actually a section from Goethe's original German poem, which he's holding.
I wanted to ask you, with this particular illustration, which captured my attention when I saw it the first time, the translucency. Is this the technique that's called chine colle?
I don't know. It might be.
You use tissue paper, don't you?
I do use tissue paper. I haven't heard that term before. I've just got some tissue paper lying around, so I just cut it up and tried it for the bottles, because obviously I wanted that sense of glass and transparency.
It's not that technique then. That's where they put the tissue paper onto the printing plate and they print at the same time. But it's beautiful.
This is just cut out and stuck on by hand.
Wonderful.
And that's the other thing I should mention, is that none of this is digital. Every single illustration in the book exists in real life and was drawn, created, collaged by hand. So now the flood is getting deeper. The Sorcerer's Apprentice is in a bit of a muddle. Because the brooms are wood, I've added leaves. They're sprouting leaves because they come alive. And of course, there are now two brooms, because he's cut the first one up and it's grown into two brooms. So now he's doubled the problem. And the score behind him is, of course, the music by Dukas.
Did you want to escape from the Disney
Very
vacation?
much. Absolutely. I wanted it to look nothing like the Disney. There are no mice at all anywhere, called Mickey or otherwise.
Oh, wow.
So this is the Swan of Tuonela. So in this story, the hero, Lemminkainen, who's actually a terrible rogue, he thinks the world of himself. He thinks he's marvelous, and he thinks this the most beautiful girl in Finland will automatically want to marry him. Actually, he never meets her. He meets the mother, who's a witch and a queen, and she sets him these 3 tasks. And the final one is to go to the land of the dead. Tuonela is the land of the dead in Finnish mythology, and he has to shoot the Swan of Tuonela, who, as you said earlier, is represented in the music by a cor anglais, most beautiful piece of music. But it doesn't turn out very well for Lemminkainen. Things go horribly wrong for him. You'll have to read the book to find out how.
Indeed.
There he is meeting the mother, the witch queen, who's got some pesky looking wolves at her side. I had great fun using all these textures for the skies in this, because I wanted to capture a sense of wind, the northern lights, icy, frosty, cold trees, all those things I just found really exciting to play with, because I didn't have a fixed idea of how they should look like and how it should work. So it was only when I started putting the papers down that I began to think, oh, actually, that could look like the Northern Lights. That could work really well for a tree. So I'm not necessarily having preconceived thoughts about this. I'm not printing things and thinking, okay, that line of print's definitely for a tree. I don't think like that. I print lots and lots of papers. Then I cut them up afterwards and discover, kind of by accident.
Brilliant. I want to say, horse anatomy is quite difficult, even if you're drawing, and you've managed it with collage.
Well, it's only half a horse, to be fair.
Well, the bones look right to me.
Well, you can always cut the legs off and stick them on again if they go wrong with collar. That's a great thing. Here we have the Flight of the Bumblebee. So everyone knows this piece of music, but very few people know it comes from this fabulous fairy tale. It's the second time I've told this story, because a version of this appears in Koshka's Tales, which was based on the folk tale. But then Pushkin, who heard the folk tale from his nurse, wrote a famous verse poem, which is much more specific and quite different to the folk tale in certain aspects. And that's what Rimsky-Korsakov based his opera on. In the Pushkin, there are 3 transformations. He turned into 3 insects, a mosquito, a wasp, and a bee, I think. But in the opera, Rimsky-Korsakov cut it down to just 1 insect, the famous bee, famous bumblebee. So here is the magic moment. He's been thrown into the sea as a baby with his mother by his wicked aunts, who've tricked their father into thinking his father into thinking he's a monster. And many years later, when he's grown up, he wants to get back to Russia to find his father and find out why he was thrown into the sea. But he has no means of getting back home. But fortunately, on the island where he's ended up, there's a magic swan princess, and she turns him into the famous bumblebee, and off he flies. And he lands on this ship and goes back home to find his father.
Just looking at the costume here and the sort of pleating that you've put in with, rather than just one piece of paper there, and the stripes, where you've used kind of thin ink so that the color comes through and gives it that nice texture.
Yeah, one of the joys of doing lino prints for this purpose is that you're not trying to produce the perfect print as a printmaker would to frame and hang on the wall. For this, it's quite fun to let the ink go dry and then print it, and then you only get a bad quality print, but one that's very useful because, as you say, it allows the color to show through and creates interesting textures. And this is the city we glimpsed before. Ledinets, or in my version it's called Lollipop City. That's how it's sometimes translated in Russia, with an army of 30 silver knights and a squirrel cracking golden nuts to reveal emeralds. It's such an enchanted island, this one.
It's just stunning.
There we are. There's the Mountain King himself, with again that same lino cut has become his hair and his beard.
This visual language looks very different to what we've just seen, the contrast.
Yes, and I think that each story has its own musicality, it has its own, with me, it's a very emotional reaction to the music. So I think for this, I wanted something very different. I mean, it is my favorite piece of music in the whole world. It would be the one desert island disc that I kept at the end if I were on that desert island. And I wanted this to feel very Eastern and Oriental. I wanted it to have that quality about it. And you can see the papers that I bought in Spain here, based on Moorish tiles, which just seemed perfect to create these beautiful images and these beautiful backgrounds, I mean. And I had just been to the Alhambra in Granada shortly before illustrating this book, so I had the visions of all these arches and tiles and patterns very clear in my mind when I came back from that. All those beautiful Islamic pieces of art. Incredible.
I want to stay and luxuriate in it, but I can't. We have to move on.
So Scheherazade, the music has 4 sections, and the first is called the Sea and Sinbad Ship. So I had to decide which of his 7 adventures at sea I would tell. Actually, I mixed up 2 of them in the end, but this is the famous first story where his ship, or the ship he's on, is on the back of a sea monster by mistake. They make camp on the back of a sea monster, mistaking it for an island, and he tumbles off and lands in the sea. An Arabian Nights Palace. And now we're on to William Tell and the famous shooting of the apple off his own son's head. And there's the evil Gessler. And there's a lot of colour symbolism in this. I mean, Robin Hood is obviously a very similar character. So I've dressed William Tell in green clothes because he lives in the mountains in a similar way. The frightened villagers or townsfolk are in blue, looking subdued in the background. Gessler's wearing blood red. And the apple on his head is blood red too. So I think very carefully about the colours for scenes like this one. This is the moment of William Tell's escape from the evil Gessler. And he's still clutching his trusty crossbow, which he will use very shortly to kill Gessler with and set Switzerland free.
Finished artwork of what you showed us the earlier.
That's right. So the left-hand side is the section we saw earlier. Wow. And the William Tell Overture comes from an opera, of course. The opera's huge and vast and long and isn't performed very often. It does end with this glorious chorus. After all the trials and tribulations, it ends with the sun rising and a free Switzerland. It's actually a really cathartic, emotional piece of theatre. So I wanted to allude to that with this as the final illustration, with the sun rising and Switzerland set free.
I think we're just going to stop the share for a moment at this point, aren't we, and take a few questions from our audience. We have got time to do that. So if you would like to ask James a question, could I just ask you, look at the menu bar at the bottom and use the Q&A rather than the chat, because I'll be taking the questions from the Q&A. So we have a question in there already. And it's, could I ask it on behalf of Catherine Ward? She says, my son is loving finding all the pictures you've been showing on the slides in his copy of the book. And he would like to ask you, William, her son, would like to ask you, if he may, when is Mrs. Noah's Song coming out? As he loves these books too.
Well, that's fabulous. Thank you, William. Thank you for enjoying all these books. That's wonderful. Mrs. Noah's Song, if I finish it in time, I've got about 2 months left to finish it now, actually slightly less, 6 weeks. It's due to be published June next year. So you'll have to wait a little bit of time, but June 2022.
I just want to ask you, James, because once upon a time, you've developed further techniques. Now, when you go back and do a third Mrs. Noah's book, have you got to keep it consistent with the other 2? Because you were talking about that in relation to the Katie and the Ella Bella books. What happens there?
Yes, you have got to keep it consistent. And it's an interesting question because this story is actually quite different from the first 2 Mrs. Noah books anyway. So I have found it quite a difficult book to illustrate in some way. That's good because it challenges me and keeps me experimenting, I think. One of the key things that keeps it consistent is those liner cuts, because I've kept all the liner cuts that I made for Mrs. Noah. So I'm bringing those out again and I'm using those again for the textures in this book. So that will automatically give it a sense of consistency, of belonging in the same world. but this book doesn't have the same sort of settings. The first one has the floods and has all these landscapes. The second one has a garden growing, and this one's a very different story. I don't want to give anything away because it's a really, really beautiful text. It's a really beautiful text that Jackie's written. I think it's the best of the three, but it's a much quieter story in a sense. So I think the illustrations I think they feel more reflective, but I hope they'll be consistent because of these liner cuts. That's a great way of keeping everything consistent. The technique is very much the same, and I think that because I'm doing double page spreads more with this rather than the single pages and the vignettes for Once Upon a Tune, it's a slightly different world.
Mm. We've got a few more questions here. So Nicola Harvey says, do you have any tips for working with children on creating art to music?
So hello, Nicola. Thank you for joining us. I think the main tip is to find something that feels very fast and gets the color on the paper clean, bright, fresh, without having to be mixed or fussed about. I think that using pastel can be really good because you get very immediate color. And I think if you do use paint, then unless you're going to have gouache or something that's going to be very opaque, don't do it on the black paper. You can use oil pastels on black paper very successfully, but paint on black paper, unless it's gouache and very opaque, isn't going to look so great. Give them plenty of space to make a mess. Don't worry about mess. And also, I would choose a longer piece of music. It's very tempting with children to get them going with a short piece of music, but actually it's really frustrating because, I mean, in the Hall of the Mountain King that we just heard, it's what, 2 minutes long, 1.5 minutes long. That's really hard. So find a long piece of music. Scheherazad's great because you can just take one of the 4 movements. Each movement's about 10 minutes. That's a nice piece of time to actually do some playing and experimenting and painting in. So length of music, and think carefully about the materials they use so that they're not frustrated.
As just very briefly, as well as the creative possibilities, of course, it's also great for children's kinesthetic awareness that then leads into all sorts of other skills to do with manual dexterity, including writing. You know, you can be doing it all through music and art. So, oh, sorry, James. Yeah, you want to come back on that?
Well, I've been amazed. I mean, I've been visiting schools for over 30 years and doing all sorts of projects based around the Katie books and this, that, and the other. But the painting to music workshops have amazed me at how children really can focus and lose themselves in the music if the circumstances are right. You need a good quality sound system in a classroom, particularly if you've got 30 kids in a classroom, and you need good speakers and good sound. That makes all the difference. But it's the autistic children, the elective mutes, the troubled, disturbed children who don't normally join in. Very often they're the ones who will suddenly come up from underneath the table where they're hiding and do an amazing piece of art. It might be completely abstract, it might be very strange, but it'll be something wonderful for them. And it's sometimes been a very moving thing to visit classrooms and see these children and see the teachers crying because this child they've not been able to do anything with is suddenly responding to the music. And I'm not taking any credit for this. It's not me, it's the music. Music is a very powerful international language that really communicates to children. If you create the right environment, if you give them the right context and give the right imagery so they understand what the music is about, it can be a really powerful thing. And I think that's a very important point because so many people think classical music is very gentle and sweet and you play it at bedtime, but actually classical music, what we call classical music, let's say orchestral music, can be really powerful. It can be terrifying, can be funny, can be dramatic, can be erotic. It can be all those things. And I think, you know, this book, I hope, covers music that will touch on very many emotions and hopefully be surprising to people who feel that it's not really their world, not really their thing.
Okay, I've got time for 2 more questions because we're going to have to announce the winner of this competition. So this next question is from Benjamin Harris, and he says he would like to know if there are any pieces that you would like to illustrate for children that are not the usual ones, because he was particularly impressed by the inclusion of the swan. He's at the top of the screen, so you can see him.
Thank you, Ben. That's a fantastic question. And there are many, many pieces that I'd love to include. Pieces like Baba Yaga from Pictures at an Exhibition, which is a well-known work, nearly went in the book. And even things like the 1812 Overture, it would have been interesting to tell the story, you know, a non-fiction story of Napoleon. So I even considered that. But going off the beaten track, Rimsky-Korsakov was a fascinating composer. He wrote so many fairy tales, so many pieces based on legend and myth. He wrote another symphony, a bit like Scheherazade, called Antar, A-N-T-A-R. And it's a beautiful another Arabic story. It's about an Arabic poet who falls in love with this fairy in the ruins of Palmyra. It's a very beautiful story, although he does die at the end. And there are many, many other works. The Legend of the Invisible City of Kitej, which is an extraordinary story. And there's a beautiful orchestral suite. It's actually an opera. But again, like with Flight of the Bumblebee, there are orchestral pieces which are extracted and played on their own. Many, many pieces by Rimsky-Korsakov would be fabulous for that sort of thing. And there are so many I've worked with in a concert hall. Tintagel by the English composer Bax. Wonderful piece of music, which obviously links to King Arthur and Excalibur and all those wonderful legends and myths. So yes, I can't use up the time telling you all about all of them, but there are many, many, many other pieces that you could work with.
Oh, do you know, I think I've got a feeling there might be a book called Twice Upon a Tune. So anyway.
Well, I hope Jeanette is listening.
I'm going to follow with Nick Campbell's question, because I think it sort of links to what Ben asked. And he's thanking you for this wonderful book and the insight into your creative process. But he does say he wonders whether you ever draw to music along with an existing story, but in the process of doing that, discover new or unexpected stories and images in them, which I think is a really interesting question.
It's a really thought-provoking question, and I think yes is the answer to that, because with some of the works and the works in this book, we know the story, they're very fixed and there isn't much room for maneuvering, because you want to be faithful to the source and you want to do it with integrity. But with other things, there is a lot of ambiguity. So with Scheherazade in particular, we don't know exactly what stories Rimsky-Korsakov was referencing, and he was very coy about it. He said, I want the titles of the movements just to give a hint of the way my imagination was going, but this is up to you as the listener. He actually said that in his autobiography. And that's the key point. I read his autobiography, I did lots of research, but there's no fixed answer. So I read many, many editions of the Arabian Nights, discovered all sorts of stories I'd never heard of, including one of the stories that I reference in this book, the tale of Camaralzaman and Badura, one of my absolute favorite fairy tales in the whole world now. So if I hadn't done this project, if I hadn't explored the music, I would never have discovered that story. So there's that side to it. But then also sometimes you get a piece of music which occasionally I've been asked to paint to, which doesn't have a story fixed to it at all. And one example would be a string quartet asked me to do something with a string quartet by Mendelssohn. And I thought, well, there's no story, there's no program, you know, it's just an abstract piece of music. What do I do? So I did research into Mendelssohn and found out that he lived at the same time as the Grimm brothers. The families were acquainted, so that he knew the brothers Grimm. So I looked at the brothers Grimm stories and thought, well, is there a story here that would work? And of course, the Bremen Town musicians, it's about 4 musicians. So it's perfect for a string quartet. So we used that. I retold the story and it's fitted the music surprisingly well.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Thanks, Nick, for such a thought-provoking question, as indeed all the others have been as well. There possibly are more questions and we haven't got time to ask and answer them. But if you want to put your thoughts and comments into the chat, I will make sure I take a copy of this and I'll forward it to James along with the recording of the event this evening as well. So you'll get to see what people are thinking and the questions that they have. Now, what do we do? Are we going back to the slides? Are we choosing the winner? Let's have a look.
Well, we can go back to the slide. Are there any slides left? I can't remember.
I think there are slides of forthcoming
oh, yes.
Music. There we
go. So this book has been delayed a year because obviously we hoped to do some of the painting and music concerts to go with the book, and we weren't able to last year. We're really hoping we'll be able to go ahead this year. This will be a fantastic concert in Sheffield with the Sheffield Philharmonic, as you can see from the poster. it's been specially arranged by George Morton. He's a composer and arranger and conductor. And he's arranged it so that it can be played by a smaller orchestra than normal. So if we have to socially distance, the orchestra will be able to socially distance. So we think the concert should be able to go ahead without any problem. And we're going to be playing most of the music and just one of the movements from Scheherazade, because the whole of Scheherazade lasts nearly an hour. That's too long. So we're going to be presenting a really rich, wonderful concert of music. And I'm going to be painting along like crazy.
And we're all thinking, aren't we, how difficult life has been for musicians and how important it is to get back to, live concerts. I can't wait to get back to live concerts. That's
a really important point to make, actually, is that one of the most important things about this book and about music education in schools in particular is that obviously it's very beleaguered, they've had a lot of cuts, but the emphasis is always on learning an instrument, and that's a lovely ideal, and of course we want that to happen, but not enough attention, I think, is given to training people to listen and encouraging new audiences. So that's what this book is about. This is about the audiences of tomorrow, which will be jobs for musicians tomorrow as well. And so that's why I think it's a book that I'm really proud of, because I really do think that in schools and in homes, this is a book that can allow people to open their ears and open their eyes and open a door to this world of music that's given me so much pleasure for so many years, and find a way into going to concerts and enjoying the music that they wouldn't otherwise have been able to do.
Well, we'll just stop the share for a moment, because I think it's a bit of a drum roll moment. We did have a draw earlier today. We took a couple of names just in case the person who came first out of the hat wasn't here. And James is going to announce, are you not, the winner?
I am indeed. I haven't got a drum to roll, I'm afraid, which I ought to have with a book about music, but I don't. So the winner of the lino cuts is, if she is present, Barbara Valentini. Can you let it be known if you are here? Because if you are here...
Can we spotlight Barbara if she's in the audience? She's here. She says, I am here.
Congratulations, Barbara. You have won the set of 6 hand-printed in this very studio lino prints.
Brilliant. Barbara, if you send your address where you would like them sent, you can send that to me or to us at assistant.literature@gmail.com, and then I'll liaise with James about how we get those prints to you. So if you just send me your address, don't put it in the chat or on publicly. So I think there isn't, we're not much over time this evening, I don't think. Is there anything else that you wanted to say? Any parting words? If not, I will round up.
Just a huge thank you to you, to Otterbury Books, Janetta especially, and to everybody who's joined in tonight. I'm so grateful for all the love and support people have shown this book. It really is a labour of love, a passion project. And so it's really wonderful to see people being positive and supportive about it. It means the world to me. So thank you so much. And thank you for being here tonight.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would also like to add my thanks, obviously, and I'm going to start with Otterbury Books. Thank you really for allowing me to host this event and reaching out, because there's no event that I would rather have been a part of. It's been great. And thank you to the audience who are clearly so engaged, because you can tell with the kinds of questions that are coming through that they've really been inspired by everything that you've had to say this evening. Thank you to my Caroline, who's been there making sure behind the scenes that everything runs smoothly. But of course, the biggest thanks are reserved for you, James Mayhew, for producing the book and for giving us such a insightful and I use the word inspiring. I try not to use it very much, but I do mean it this evening. You've given us an inspiring evening. So thank you so much.
Absolutely my pleasure. I could have talked for another 3 hours quite comfortably. So I hope we squeezed enough in.
I could have listened. Thanks so much. And good night to everybody. Thank you for joining us. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.